Hey everyone, I'm Alex Delecta, and this is Dungeons and Dragons and Drawing, and I'm here today with my good friend Gavin Portman, talking about his character.
Milocretus, Mercutio, Merlin, Melodaous, Music Weaver, at your service.
His life like growing up, like
He didn't have a very good family life growing up at all. I wrote it into his backstory that he, in a very Tyrion Lannister way, killed his mom when she gave birth to him. And so that caused a lot of resentment with his dad. And the night that Milo was born, several different horrible things happened. There was a horrible raging storm in the little halfling village that his family lived in. Orcs came and raided and pillaged most of the town that night as well. And when he was born, he killed his mom. So I had a lot of mystery kind of surrounding Milo's birth and the circumstances of it. And that all of those things together, he was the youngest kid of this big halfling family of pretty wealthy bards. And the night he was born, their lives got uprooted and all of these horrible things happened. And so there was a lot of resentment towards him. He grew up on the road because his family they suddenly had nothing. So they had to pack up everything and they tried to make their way as traveling bards instead of the more wealthy, land-owning songwriters and playwrights that they had been before. But his family, being very wealthy, wasn't used to that. They were always wanting more than what they had because they were used to wealthy lives. And so they would often steal and get extra money. When performances were going on, they would have all the kids in the family go around and pickpocket people just so that they could have slightly nicer, sleeping bags on the road, or they could afford some of the nicer hotels, or they could get a really nice bottle of wine. Not because they needed to, but because they were used to this life of luxury. And so that's kind of the environment that Milo grew up in. Milo also had a very violent streak, which didn't really help him getting along with a whole bunch of other halflings who already didn't necessarily like him. He would like to pick fights with his siblings and cousins and would enjoy inciting violence. And there was a lot of effort from his dad and his aunt to try to curb that violence in him. And they tried to do that with music, first off, but I wanted to give him this kind of cornerstone as he kept coming back to not necessarily a malicious violence, but he wanted to play fight a lot. And he wanted to have that sense of rush. The three people he was closest to were his oldest brother, Mercutio, who was the only one who would really engage him in his roughhousing and was able to really beat him and withstand him because, as Milo would tell you many, many times, he's very big for a halfling. So he was always a bit of a physical force to be reckoned with amongst his family. The one parental figure he had was his uncle, Peregrine, who was married into the family and who didn't have as much of this kind of sense of things need to be done a certain way or we need to go back to this wealthy lifestyle because that wasn't what he was used to growing up. And so he would also kind of engage Milo's more violent and roughhousey streaks, mostly by telling him stories. I wrote up this idea of a collection of children's stories. I thought of this idea of a whole bunch of dwarven stories about a particular hero and how, even if they were meant to be cautionary tales about how violence isn't always the answer, the way of solving things, or if they were very, very heroic deeds, Milo was only paying attention to the action, the violence, the heroic exploits. But the person he was probably closest to was his little cousin, Uncle Peregrine, and his aunt's youngest child, and her name was Poppy. She was born on the road. She didn't really know what life was before being on the road, and so she didn't really have any of this resentment harbored towards Milo. But she loved the way that he would tell stories and use his magic to make little trinkets and baubles, and one of the things Milo loved to do as a kid was animate or make illusions of clay or leaves or other just little figures and make them play fight. And Poppy would always love watching him do that and would join in on the fun, and she was kind of his only playmate amongst a whole bunch of other people who were more studious and who didn't want to roughhouse and play and just imagine in the same way. He was actively shunned from his family just because he looked at magic in a different way, because he didn't need to analyze it the way that everyone else did. One thing that he inherited from his mom was his mother's eyes, and that was both a kind of symbol for his dad, especially of, resentment and regret. But he's one of the only ones in his family with these bright green eyes. And when Ben, our DM, came to me with the idea for playing in this campaign, he texted me before we even began, and he said, "So, Gavin, do you want to be in a cult? Do you want your character to be in a secret cult?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And those are like the only parameters he gave me. He's like, your character's gonna be in a death cult. And so, as I described earlier, these kind of strange situations surrounding his birth, I'd always imagined him kind of being picked and supernatural almost in some way. And so not only does he have these green eyes that are like his mom's and unlike the majority of his other siblings, but they're also this kind of unnatural green. He noticed very early on that, his eyes were very distinctive and also a point of pain for several members of his family. And he liked that uniqueness in himself, and he always wanted to accentuate it. And so he spent a lot of time trying to gather different green clothings and trinkets to really accentuate and bring out his eyes, so that whenever people would see him or meet him for the first time, all of his clothing, everything he's wearing kind of accentuates his very charismatic, a little bit creepy, but just very drawing in stare. And eyes are something that I really, really like playing with. I'm drawn to as a person anyway, and so I wanted my D&D character to have very distinctive eyes. At the age of 15-ish, he just left, and he was like, I'm done with this. He visited all the people that were close to him when he left, and the bells that he uses as his spellcasting focus actually came from his cousin, Poppy, because not only was she Milo's best playmate, but, because of her association with him, Milo was Poppy's best playmate growing up. And so she gave him the bells so that he could always take her with her, no matter where he was. And so he determined to take his own path and, take his life into his own hands and not be abused any longer by his family. So he wandered around for a while, and he met this dwarven monk, who I imagine was a monk to a kind of trickster type deity, who loved starting bar fights. And Milo saw him fight and just fought off an entire bar one day, and Milo's like, this dwarf is the person that I need to be following. I need more fighting in my life. And so him and this dwarf traveled around for a while. He acted like a new kind of, not only someone to be friends with and to really engage this rush, this adrenaline, this fun, but also a mentor for him, because he would teach him, or try at least to impart some monastic knowledge and show him about the benefits of chaos. Milo, not being the wisest of individuals, didn't really regard all of this too highly and just loved the way that this monk, this dwarven monk, who I named after a video game character from a video game I used to play as a kid a lot, named Kelgar Ironfist, would teach him finally how to fight. And so Milo was not only learning magic, but he was also learning fighting from this guy, and they traveled around for a while, and Milo finally felt accepted by someone, and that was big for him. The only person in his life who he ever felt really, truly, fully accepted him for who he was, because even amongst the people that were close to him and his family, there was still always this barrier, or his mom and aunt were always looking over him, so he couldn't ever truly be himself. But with this guy, he could. With Kelgar, he could go and travel around and do all these different things, and he wasn't set to any sort of standard except for the friendship that they had, so he could do anything. But eventually, Kelgar got summoned back to the monastery, and all of this hope and excitement that Milo had in his life was just sunk. There was no one to travel with. There was no icon to kind of attach his stories and his writing to. And he wasn't having the same kind of experiences, because, it's one thing when two people go in and start a bar fight together and then leave together. They, at the end of the night, still have each other. But when you go into a bar in a strange town and start a bar fight by yourself, and you're not that good at fighting yet, you just get beat up and thrown out and no one likes you. And he got this idea in his head of, well, what if I can just bring back some other companion? What if I can bring someone else back to write stories about again? To fight so greatly like this, like Kelgar did, and I can be someone's traveling skald, someone's real traveling bard that goes with them and goes on these epic quests and has these battles. And so he thought back to his childhood and remembered this children's book on dwarven exploits that he had read. And he got it into his head that instead of finding a new person, the thing he needed to do, the real crowning jewel on his achievement of being a bard, was going to be to bring back this particular hero so that he could write his stories again. And so he started researching necromancy. And this is what got him into the cult. So after practicing necromancy a little bit, the Black Tongues, as they were called, found him. And this cult was what Ben came up with, the name for them and the kind of person that they worshipped, and a couple of the members of them, though I got to make up a couple of the members of the cult as well. But Milo ended up joining this cult because of his obsession with necromancy and being an impressionable young halfling who had lost the one person he was closest to. He was in a very emotionally vulnerable state. And these Black Tongues took him in and showed him a little bit of necromancy, but also taught him about death and balance and how killing people is good in some ways, how death isn't something to be afraid of. And like any impressionable teenager, which is roughly what he was in halfling years, Milo, swallowed their creed really, really quickly and eagerly. And he found this sense of community with them again. There was one particular member who was very matronly and was very kind and nice to him. And they also enjoyed Milo's penchant for violence and roughhousing, combined with this idea of necromancy. He was very easily inducted into this cult. I like to think of, you think of most cults as very strictly reinforced, robes, chants, not very open to fun or other things of that nature, because they're a cult, they have one purpose, and part of indoctrination is getting everyone to believe one thing and essentially be a similar kind of person. And I always imagined Milo got into the Black Tongues, and just being the sheer personality that he is and the roughhousing, essentially, kid that he still was, he would tell stories and sing songs and get in fights in the strict cult, and brought a little bit of sunshine to the Black Tongues, which, some members enjoyed and others not so much. But he was deep in prayer, and this cult was dedicated to the death goddess Nim. And one night he got a message from Nim. He heard this kind of whispering in his ear that said, "Go forth, Milo. I have been watching you for a while. Go forth and bring death." And so he was essentially tasked by the goddess of death and given the role in the cult of being their eyes and ears outside of their kind of niche community. And so he would go out and he would travel and he would discover all sorts of different bits of information, and he would kill people whenever he found the opportunity to do so, because he had the ability to, whenever Milo in particular killed someone, they would go straight to Nim and straight into her domain of death. They would have the option to be revived, of course, but they wouldn't necessarily go on to any sort of afterlife beyond that. They wouldn't go to whatever outer plane they were supposed to go to next. And so his job with the cult became to just go out, see what was happening in the world above and outside of the cult itself, and kill people when he could. And that was what he did. And the most effective way that he thought to do that was to enlist in the army, because you get to kill people without consequences there. So I think of the members of our little troop, he was a volunteer in the army and was not conscripted. So that's how he ended up there at the end.